Thank you, Mr. President. Colleagues, it's my real pleasure and honor to share with you the amendments that we are going to be voting on concurrence as they have left the Assembly for SB 3. We have already debated SB 3 last year. This is a 2-year bill, so I will spare you my soapbox. But I will remind everybody that the reason SB 3 is before us is reflected in a comment made by President Obama, which is that income inequality is the defining challenge of our era. Over 60% of working people are living paycheck to paycheck, literally living paycheck to paycheck. The inflation-adjusted median wage for workers over the past 20 years, for the bottom 40%, which include all minimum wage workers, has actually decreased by over 10%. So workers are struggling. 2.2 million Californians are currently earning minimum wage, and they are living in poverty because it is a sub-poverty wage. So that is why we are here. The differences between what we voted on last year and this year are as follows. In many respects, this is actually a more modest proposal than what the Senate has already passed, and I'll describe why I say that. In the original SB 3, we would have gotten to $13 an hour as a minimum wage for California by 2017. In this proposal, we won't get to $13 an hour until 2020, 3 years later. There are then 2 additional steps in this version to take us to $14 an hour in 2021 and another dollar increment in 2022. Another provision that this version has that the original one did not is that it gives small businesses an extra year to get to not only $13 an hour, but also to $15 an hour. It delays the entire program by 1 year. And then additionally, this amended version has what we're referring to as a pause button or an off-ramp, which authorizes the governor to meet one of 2 tests. One is economic, the other is budgetary, so that if there is a drop in sales tax receipts, if the economy is slowing significantly by certain definitions in the bill, that the governor is able to pause the next step up until we get to 15. The original bill had no such provisions. Keep in mind that this legislature, by the same simple majority vote that it can pass this bill today, can at any time in the future make adjustments to it or in fact repeal it. So we retain control always, though the bill specifically and proactively gave the governor authority to make decisions on his or her own should there be need in unknown fiscal times. So those are the differences between the 2 bills. One last and important difference is that when Assemblywoman Gonzalez successfully put into law 3 sick paid leave days for workers in California, unfortunately, in-home support service workers were carved out of that. This restores those 3 days for them as well. Again, 1 day up by 2018, a 2nd day by 2020, and the 3rd day by 2022 when we're at full implementation of the $15 an hour minimum wage. Those are the differences between the 2 bills. I ask for your concurrence on Assembly amendments.
Thank you. Members, debate or discussion on this item. Senator Gaines.
Thank you, Mr. President. I rise in opposition to Senate Bill 3. Our job in this building should be to help people climb the economic ladder, not cut off the bottom rungs. That is exactly what will happen if we shove through an unprecedented cost increase on businesses. This policy will be a gain for those lucky enough to keep their minimum wage jobs, for sure. It'll be a disaster for those who lose them because they don't have the experience or skill to justify that wage. They will be unemployed. Their minimum wage will be 0. And I want us to think about this vast state and how different it is. Rural wages are not like urban wages. I have a successful business restaurant owner in my district named Bruce Dean, who founded Black Bear Diner. He makes a great point when he says that this one-size-fits-all solution does not recognize the huge cost of living differences in our state. Here's an example. In high-wage San Jose, $15 will be below the 50% of median wage. But in Redding, where Mr. Dean lives, $15 would be 68% of the median. That means in the poorer parts of my district, struggling businesses are going to be on the hook to give immediate raises to a far larger pool of employees. There's going to be a death sentence to many businesses in my district and the employees who depend on them. And in my district, the cost of living is so different. The MIT wage calculator predicts that in 2022, a so-called living wage in Modoc County, which is in the far northern reaches of my district, would be $10.98 an hour. In San Francisco, it would be $16.41 an hour. They don't have similar economies at all. This poorly conceived policy will raise employer costs on workers' comp, unemployment insurance, and taxes, and will help cement California's position as the worst place to do business. This increase would be a fake raising tide that would actually sink a lot of boats. I urge a no vote.
Thank you, Senator Gaines. Senator Hertzberg.
Thank you, Mr. President. Why do we need a minimum wage? Why not let employees' salaries float on the open market, just like we do, say, for this computer or for this pen? Why not, if an employer is so good, should that employer not pay an employee 17 cents an hour or $1 a day? Why do we not? Why does that offend us? Because I would submit that even the most aggressive open marketers, free marketers, would say that 17 cents an hour violates a basic moral premise. I think that there's a difference. And the difference is that in America, there is a basic sense that if you go to work, that if you play by the rules, that if you work hard, you got enough money to take care of your family. It's a basic underlying essence of what America is about. What differentiates us from so many other nation states around the world. And so what are those numbers? I look at the MIT calculator as well, which is a much more conservative calculator than the Center for California Budget Project. But if you look in my county just a few years ago, that wage, what does it cost to live? What are the basics? Not to go to private school or to have fancy stuff. What does it cost for food, for health care, for housing and utilities, transportation? It's basically $11.33 an hour. Not much difference than the $10.98 an hour that was referred to with respect to another part of the state. If you look as what was expressed in the amendments here, the amount of the wages go up in January 2018 to $11 an hour. Now, that doesn't include the subsidies for CalFresh, the SNAP program, Covered California, EITC, housing subsidies, and the other kinds of things that taxpayers have to pay because we as a society say there's a basic moral standard by which folks should live. That is the question. Now, what we've seen in times of election and every time when this minimum wage was created, we have seen rhetoric, example after example, of the story of the sky is falling. Well, what does the data show? What do the facts show when you step back without regard to party, without regard to points of view? Just what do the numbers show? And when you look at the economists that have looked at this throughout the years, what does it show? Well, in 1938, we created in the United States the Fair Labor Standards Act, and it implemented a 25-cent an hour wage. At the time, the National Association of Manufacturers said that the Fair Labor Standards Act constitutes a step in the direction of communism, Bolshevism, fascism, and Nazism. There were no economic downturns in 1938 at the time. In 1950, at the time, as a consequence, by virtue of what the experts look at with respect to that wage. In 1950, the wage went from 40 cents to 75 cents. Unemployment declined from 6.5% in 1950 to a low of 3% in 1951. Again, March 1st, 1956. Wages went from 75 cents, the minimum wage, from 75 cents to $1. Again, the month that this measure was enacted, unemployment rates went from 4.2%. A year later, 3.7%. Example after example. In the mid-'70s, we certainly had the energy crisis, and there were some other economic determinations. And in 1980, in the heat of campaigns, which always happens in the heat of campaigns, Ronald Reagan was the governor of this state who did a lot of great things. I am not someone who will just simply throw someone out because they are of a different party. He is the gentleman who wrote a lot of the environmental laws and did a lot of other things in California that I think were important. But he said in Time magazine in the heat of that campaign, the minimum wage has caused more misery and unemployment than anything since the Great Depression. Yet wages went up from $3.10 to $3.35 an hour at the time, and there were no discernible impacts by virtue of looking at all the various reports. All I'm trying to tell you is let's just differentiate the rhetoric from the economic circumstances. Let's marry that with the underlying core values of who we are and what differentiates us, what makes America great by playing by the rules and being able to provide for your family. And I'm not going to take the time, but I took a lot of time personally and went through the various studies and looked at what economists talked of channels for adjustment in the event that you have these wage increase changes. They looked at reduction in hours worked, reduction in non-wage benefits, expenditures on job training, fewer young people, higher prices that are being charged. Well, I looked at the studies for fast food restaurants and what the impacts were and what they actually did in terms of improving efficiencies. The bottom line of it all is that if you look at productivity of the U.S. worker, they grew by 72.2% between 1973 and 2014. Americans are working harder. So if you just take the pure economic analysis and say, well, what value do you get? What's the value of this pen? What's the value of this computer? Well, the value of the working folks that are producing for America has been increasing dramatically. I'm not going to go to the numbers to which were referred earlier as to what their compensation has been, but the bottom line is that their productivity has increased. And so the notion that this argument about the minimum wage, will there be impacts? Of course. Is this a perfect bill? No. Are there weaknesses and challenges? Yes. Do the restaurateurs make some points with respect to the front of the house and the back of the house? Absolutely. Are there issues with respect to social services and child care and issues that need to be taken care of with respect to this measure? Absolutely. Is there a safety valve that, in my judgment, that's a good safety valve, gives a little bit too much power to the executive branch and the Department of Finance? Absolutely. But the bottom line is this. What if we did nothing? What if we did nothing? What is the cost of providing services to folks? What is the impact of giving more money to people and making this transition? The truth of the matter is that we have been here before, that we have heard the same arguments before, time and time again. That the reality is that this is a tension that dominates these legislative bodies at the national level and across all jurisdictions. And it is always the fight. It is always the fight. But at the end of the day, it is about that moral component. It is about what is this country about. It is that when you are students of history and look at what the history of the human political order has been, it has been, and the greatness of this country is creating a middle class. Folks that make a couple bucks an hour aren't investing in tax straddles in the Bahamas. They're buying an extra pair of shoes for their kids. They're maybe putting a couple bucks away to be able to pay for school or to fix their house or whatever the case may be. It is the cornerstone and backbone of America. It is the most, there's no offshoring of this money. There's no money in some offshore account that we have to repatriate somewhere. This is the stuff that you make America about. You know, they're buying all the products. They're doing the stuff. It doesn't work. Otherwise, you get monopoly where somebody wins the game and the game's over and everybody goes bankrupt. It doesn't work that way. So yes, is there a tension? Yes. Yes, is it difficult at times? Yes. But the truth of the matter is this has been a struggle that we have always dealt with. And the failure to deal with it in any constructive way, are we going to have to make changes and corrections down the line? Always. That's what we're here for as a legislative branch of government. But I just share with everybody, because I hear these discussions, I hear the fear, I hear the noise, but the truth and the facts don't bear out. It is challenging. It is that point of tension. But I would suggest that we are not talking about a minimum wage. We are talking about a family wage. We talk about values here on both sides of the aisle of what we believe in. If you can't, at the core, make a living and look at your spouse in your eye or your kids and come home and do work and not have to take subsistence because you don't want to do it, because you want to do it the right way, and you can't do it, aren't we contradictory? Aren't we creating that level of a problem? So if there is some level of attention, so be it. That's the nature of the capitalist system. I would just say that at the end of the day, although not perfect, this is the right thing to do. It stands for the right moral principles and does it the right way. I ask for concurrence in this measure. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Senator Hertzberg. Senator Nielsen.
Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen of the Senate, these are times when the Senate is at its best. Issues of great moment wherein we feel very strongly and passionately about it. Very different reasons. I rise in opposition to this measure. And I speak to the impacts that are real and not imagined. It sounds wonderful, $15 an hour, and all will prosper and be better off. I will argue that this is a Pyrrhic and elusive promise. The individual who will now have this $15 and may be better off, but for a short period of time, because that job may quickly and likely in many cases be eliminated, no longer there. That's the elusive and Pyrrhic promise. The impact will be immediate. Upon the signing of this legislation, within weeks, individuals, and I call it the hollow eyes, and I can envision in my mind's eyes those hollow eyes of the men and women and the youth who show up at work and are told their services are no longer needed. The elderly or retired person whose retirement is not quite adequate to keep them going. They've sought other work. Say a greeter at a big box store, where that job is what gives them the edge to keep going. Well, they're not going to be greeters anymore. Sorry, your services are no longer required. And to that point, we in America have become kind of, I'd argue a little bit lazy. We're used to convenience and service and not doing it ourselves. Look to that for each of us to diminish, because those who have provided those services will no longer be there. They won't be required because of $15 an hour. I think we should take that in mind. There's a student work program at Sacramento State, work experience program. It's not unique. Those kind of things are everywhere and have been a long time. Those students are not going to have those jobs. And many of those students depend on those jobs to continue their school. I think of the impacts, and I had folks from one of the counties I represent in my office yesterday, from the county and the schools, talking about this. Now, why would they be worried? Because in the county, they have individuals who are doing very important work in these jobs that receive the minimum wage. They're unequivocal. Those jobs are going to be gone. In the classrooms, those aides who help our students, and most assuredly who help our teachers, are not going to be there. That's going to have an impact on education. And we think about the help that this will provide to those individuals who get that $15 elusive and Pyrrhic opportunity. Maybe they're going to be better off for a while. But what about those hollow-eyed who go back home that night and wonder what are they going to do tomorrow? Another issue that I talked about with these folks in the office yesterday, compaction. There's just not an impact on this, if you will, lower level, entry level, minimum wage. What about anybody who's on the way up, who are trying to rise to higher levels? Well, they're not going to be real happy. There's a compaction. They're going to demand more too. That will indeed have its impact. And if you want to embrace mechanization, technology, well, I guess this will be a great stimulus, because that's what will happen. No question about it. We're going to become then a more mechanized culture. You'll go to the hamburger store and you won't have a young person or an elderly person to wait on you and take your order. You'll push some buttons and you'll open some box up and there will be your hamburger. Yeah, you'll just drive in and talk to that machine. And actually, it'll be a recording and not even a human voice. And out will come a hamburger. There won't be any person there. You surely won't have a greeter at the big box store. And what about childcare? That's a great thing, isn't it? Well, that's sure going to be more costly. I think that should be of concern to us. I've often said that the greatest poverty program is a job. We did welfare reform here a long time ago when something called the GAIN program and later became CalWorks, a program that over the decades has worked. I get testimony all the time from people who talk about their experiences with that, and it warms my heart every time to have had my small part of that over the years. And what was different about that is what we were changing welfare from if you need, you will receive, to if you need, we will develop your employability, your ability to be in the market, to have your skills, to have your education and knowledge. That means then you are available for work. You can be hired. But that's the fundamental element we're dealing with here. Can be hired. The employer has a right to make a decision. And they will make those decisions on an economic basis. I often speak about the awesome power that the legislature and the administrative branch of government and the executive branches now have. That the legislature over decades have abdicated to the administrative branch and the executive branch. Here we go again. great thing to give the director of finance this awesome power to make a determination. That concerns me greatly. And, in fact, the power to give the governor the authority and the power. Now, it is the power to suspend. I get that. But I wonder a little bit about this, what it means. Because it says the director will make the determination. And there will be an adjustment. Now, this is simply a rhetorical point, but I think it's valid and even amusing. There can be adjustment up, but if it's negative, it cannot be an adjustment down. Now, there could be, I would argue, an adjustment down that's justified. That's just a rhetorical point. That's not going to happen. But it gives the governor this authority to suspend. And it says the governor may temporarily suspend a wage increase pursuant to this no more than 2 years. I really don't know exactly what that means. He make the final determination to temporarily suspend. But the governor cannot make that determination for no more than 2 years. Does that mean in 8 years? Or 4 years? What does that mean? The ability to suspend. That is not defined. I think that is a problem in the bill. And again, it gives the governor a pretty significant power. Maybe you would argue it's justified because that's a little bit of a control. And I respect that this governor has tried to be fiscally responsible, and this would be arguably a fiscally responsible step. But then maybe it should have been insisted that it could be adjusted down too, if that be the case, like a few years ago when we were $45 billion in the red. This will impact the state of California greatly as well. We have a lot of people that work in these kinds of jobs also. It will affect, indeed, what state pays for the things that we buy. I think we should be mindful of those impacts. The $15 an hour now, as it would be, I hate to use the term index because I think this bill actually goes beyond indexing, ensures that California will always be above America. And everybody is always going to be looking then at California. And right now, I gather that some other states are saying, go for it, state of California. They're wringing their hands and saying, oh boy. And they're just waiting to grab more business from this state. As you contemplate your vote, and I know each of you are doing it in your hearts and as serious as you can, do think about the immediate impact in the very close weeks to come of that individual in the areas we represent. And particularly think about not just the coastal counties and the southern inland counties. They're much better off than the counties that most of us represent. Up and down the central and northern valley and out into the desert. Republicans and Democrats. I see in my mind's eye, and very personally, and I will even indeed this very night, some of those people in the stores in the home county, like in Red Bluff and Corning. And I'm going to see them coming and going. And in a few weeks, I'm going to know that some of them are not going to be there. Or some of them are not going to have jobs. And they won't be coming in to those stores quite as often. Those people are in my mind and in my heart. And in the long run, I think about the impact on the economy of the state of California. We should too. Ladies and gentlemen, I respectfully urge a no vote.
Thank you. Senator Monning.
Thank you, Mr. President. I rise in support of SB 3. I want to start by thanking the co-authors, my colleagues from San Francisco and Chino, for your leadership that started last year on this effort. In particular, thanks to the Pro Tem for his recent leadership in forging what I think is a historic agreement. I also rise today in recognition of the interesting coincidence that we today mark the birthday of Cesar Chavez as we stand prepared to pass a historic bill to raise the minimum wage in California. When I had the honor of working with UFW, I recall the minimum wage that farm workers were earning was $1.60 an hour. And so we look at the rise in inflation, the rise in wages generally, and then I look at the region I currently represent, where 2 years ago an economist reported, an independent economic group, that a living wage in my region would be $18 an hour. And that living wage would purchase a one-bedroom apartment for a family living in Monterey County. So this doesn't bring us close to that $18 an hour. In fact, the compromise reached doesn't bring us to the $15 an hour until 2022. And so as I hear from some constituents who are concerned about impacts on their businesses, I think it's important that we offer that comparison that was offered by the author from San Francisco. Already qualified for the November ballot was a measure that would have moved California to the $15 an hour more rapidly. It would have had no pause buttons for economic downturns, and it would have provided more benefits to low-income workers. So this represents a compromise, and it represents a compromise that I believe is prudent. It's one that has a graduated pathway. My fear is that by 2022, $15 an hour may actually put a low-income worker at a lower level vis-a-vis the federal poverty level than they are today. So just as we need to measure real-world economic impacts, we've got to keep in mind the low-income workers for whom this bill has been advanced, and the prospect of bringing dignity to work. You know, Marge Piercy, one of my favorite authors and a poet, a feminist, she has a saying, just as a pitcher needs water, a worker needs meaning in their work. And many people who work for minimum wage work in repetitive work that doesn't always have meaning on the surface. It's repetitive, it's thankless, it's hard work. And workers don't always see how that fits into a broader mosaic of a strong economy. But what they do know is if that paycheck they take home is going to get them close to paying the rent, close to having a little extra for a birthday present for a child. So members, I expect that our vote will divide on partisan lines, and yet I think it's important that we see today as an incremental step in forging a history that Cesar Chavez sacrificed to bring not just a higher wage to workers in their work, but dignity to the lowest income workers. Members, I urge an aye vote.
Thank you, Senator Monning. Senator Morlock.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, colleagues, for a good debate, a good discussion, and I appreciate the tensions between what's good for workers and what's good for business owners. And I see this bill as very serious, and I see it as an inflection point. We're going to look back on this vote a few years from now, and we're going to see which side of the debate was correct. We're going to find reverberations that will be very significant, and we're going to enjoy what I call the law of unintended consequences. You'll find out things that this will cause that we hadn't even talked about here in the debate. 22 years ago, after I predicted the bankruptcy of the County of Orange, newspapers like the LA Times and the Wall Street Journal gave me names like Cassandra and Jeremiah. And so 16 years ago, I was very public and said the passage of SB 400 in 1999 will have significant financial impacts. And SB 400 was the 3% at 50 bill. And now we're seeing cities suffer and going into bankruptcy. And I just want to import that this bill will have major negative impacts, I believe, on the state of California. And once you vote for it, even though you have a pause button, you can't go back. This vote is so critical. You cannot go back. So with rising wages, you have rising workers' compensation insurance, you have payroll taxes. This state hasn't even paid off its FUTA liability, the federal unemployment tax. Our employers are already paying a premium with just 2 other states that's higher than any of the other 47 states just because we're behind in paying our balance due to the federal government. And we're going to have higher Social Security taxes that the owners have to pay. So one businessman emailed me last night, and he said, I have a spa, I have 30 employees, and I did the math, and I decided this weekend I'm not opening a second location. There's 30 jobs. You will see a lot of businesses probably go underground, start paying more cash. An area that this state really needs to focus on is trying to prevent the underground economy from prevailing. But what happens is when you have a business that is underground is that it outbids and takes business away from our honest businesses that are paying all the costs of employing people. So we are either going to drive them out or we're going to drive them under. Now, as to business owners, if you look at the data from the state, currently 17% of our taxpayers pay 87% of the personal income taxes, less than 1 in 5. And the personal income tax is 65% of the revenues that this state receives to fund its budget. So if you raise those expenses on the producers and the risk takers, you're going to find that they're going to have lower taxable incomes. You're going to see a net reduction in our revenues. And then we're going to come along with other fine bills that'll do great things. We're going to do Senate Bill 1234, which will encourage or mandate that certain employers have pension plans, which will be another cost. And then we're going to raise tobacco taxes, and then we're going to raise gas taxes. But you're going to see your tax revenues go down net. They will not increase. So, colleagues, California already has a net migration out. The data is there. We're talking about looking at data. In California, for the first time since World War II, has a declining school enrollment. Something is happening in this state. And cramming down a minimum wage increase will damage an already fragile economy. If you look at the statistics just from LA County alone, they haven't improved in almost a decade. So thank goodness that California has Silicon Valley. So once taxpayers wake up and see their newspaper headlines tomorrow morning, the business owners are going to go, is this an April Fool's joke? Really? An increase in the minimum wage of 50%. We're not talking from $7.15 to $7.50. We're not talking 35-cent pay increase. We're talking a 50% increase. And they will do the math. And when you do the math, you realize that you're going to have to raise your prices 20% to cover the increased cost and the expected loss of clients. So what does that do to retirees on a fixed income? So this solution may help some, but I believe it will hurt many, many more. Your governor, your Department of Finance, your Legislative Analyst Office, they've all publicly published remarks about what a minimum wage increase will do to the state of California. The Department of Finance, this would lead to slower personal income growth and an anticipated negative impact on taxes collected. The governor just recently said higher minimum wage laws are not free. They raise the operating costs of many businesses, and the state must shoulder higher wages in its programs. And the Legislative Analyst Office said this measure likely would reduce the number of jobs in the California economy. I don't know if these are partisan, just alone. And as a supervisor, we were kind of glad that at the county, the state decided to assume negotiating for in-home support services. And they were pretty much just making a little bit over minimum wage, and we knew that minimum wage was going to rise, so we knew the state was going to be responsible for negotiating it. But even the governor is saying that a minimum wage increase will impact our state budget in the next 3 or 4 years by billions. I mean, it was a $4 billion number in one document. So that's my prediction. I don't see this as just a minor wage increase that we've sustained over decades of time. I see this as massive. I see the future is not very bright. And I think that if the governor signs this into law, instead of fighting the ballot measures and defeating them, that we're going to have, like I said, a major inflection point in our state's history. Colleagues, I'm opposed to SB 3 and its amendments. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. Senator Glazer.
Thank you, Mr. President, members. It's a big day today with a lot of choices and consequences before us. For many, it was a day too long in coming, I know, and for many, it was a day that maybe has come a little bit too fast. We can always use more time. I voted against this. I declined to support this bill when it came before us last year. And I want to talk about the reasons for that and why today might be a different day. There's no doubt about the positives that come out of the legislation that's before us, lifting millions out of poverty. What an incredible opportunity to help so many. But the big challenges in this issue of minimum wage, for me at least, have focused around the issue of the spikes, the rapid rise in cost and obligations to business, as well as the issue of the COLA and indexing that gives the appearance of an out-of-control cost increase that no one really can make choices about. And I want to talk about both of them. You know, I did see in the documents that I got over the last couple days that we're celebrating the 100th birthday of the minimum wage, established in 1916 here in California. And when you look at the history of the wage over time, there's a couple things that are worth noting. Number one, that it experienced a lot of these sudden spikes through the course of those 100 years, that there were periods of big rapid increases followed by not a lot going on. You can go back and look at periods of time that you think might match today or might not match today in terms of what we're facing and where our economy is. You can go back to 1996 to 2002. We raised the minimum wage 58% in those 6 years, from 96 to 2002, very similar to what's being proposed in this legislation today. During the inflationary times of the late 70s and early 80s, we raised the minimum wage 67% in 3 years. In the early 70s, we raised it 51% in 2.5 years. I would note that 2 of those raises were done under the signature of Governor Reagan. Both in 1968, the minimum wage was raised, and he signed legislation providing almost a 27% increase in the minimum wage. And in 1974, the legislature passed, and Governor Reagan signed a 21% increase in the minimum wage. And certainly you could even go back and look at the period during the war, World War II, and right after the legislature raised the minimum wage 97% in 4.5 years. So this issue of spikes is a real issue. I think no matter what side of the debate you're on, you'll say that's not a healthy thing for business. It's not a healthy thing that allows folks to plan and make choices and adjustments. Yet, when we go back and look over these 100 years, we see that issue of spikes, and it's an uncomfortable one. In the 100 years of the minimum wage, we've raised it 27 times, and a lot of it has been in these areas, these years of spikes, where the pressure is off, and then the pressure builds up, and the legislature and the governor acts. The second area that I looked at carefully is this issue of COLAs, where you have no choice, that it's always going to go up. And so what I tried to do was to look back over the last 40 years and say, if we had the bill that's before us today in effect, where would the minimum wage be today? Where would it be? What would be facing a minimum wage out of control that would create great distress and harm to our economy or not? And what I found was that if you go back 40 years, and I know conditions change, so I tried to take a wide span of time, the minimum wage today, and let me make this caveat, that the proposal before us is not an index without caps. The proposal before us is an index with a cap, a 3.5% cap. So I applied those criteria to that view of where would our minimum wage be today. And if we go back 40 years, the minimum wage today, not $10 where it currently sits, would be $5.68 under the bill that's before us right now with the 3.5% cap. If you go back and you look at it, let's say 30 years from today, under the conditions of this bill, what would the minimum wage be? It would be $6.80. And even if you went back 10 years, the minimum wage under this legislation would be $8.03, well below what we currently have as our minimum wage. So for me, at least, on one hand, you have this issue of spikes, yes, moving the minimum wage up in a large amount over a period of years. On the other hand, it's balanced by a proposal that has an index with a cap that provides a much more conservative level of, certainly if you look back historically, at what that wage may be. And so were you to apply that look in the crystal ball going out 40 years, again, with an economy that we know will shift and change as it has over the last 40 years, you have the negative side of the increase, the quick increase, at least over 6 years, not that quick, balanced with a index with a cap that's going to allow for a much gradual and more predictable change over the next, not 6 years, but 10, 20, 30, 40-year time horizons that will get us to a place of much more balanced and predictable situation. So when I looked at the original bill that came before us last year and what's before us today, I do see these very significant differences. It does do what we have done over 100 years, which is the pressure builds up and then we act with a much more substantial increase balanced out with this indexing with a cap. Finally, I want to make a couple of additional points, some of which have been made by members earlier. The proposal for the increase in the minimum wage has nothing to do with any kind of government giveaway. It's only earned by someone working very, very hard in difficult jobs, repetitive jobs, whether it's picking the crops in the field or serving us in restaurants, taking care of the elderly and the disabled, providing maintenance around our homes and around our shops. It's actually going to help reduce government subsidy for many people by bringing so many out of poverty. And finally, the issue of who's paying for this. We know there's consequences for business, but the cost of this is going to be borne by everybody at every level of income, whether they're the poorest or the wealthiest. And in fact, it's easy to understand why those on the lower economic spectrum are actually going to pay more for the actions that we're going to take today than those on the top. And I'll tell you, people talk a lot about global warming as being the issue of our time. I actually think the issue is income inequality. That when you drill down to what creates destabilization within society and within democracies, it is the gap between the haves and the have-nots. It's destabilizing and it's dangerous. And it does require our careful attention. And it does require thoughtful action, which I believe is reflected in the bill that's before us. No bill is perfect. There are issues and concerns raised today, and I know we all have about its impact on business, its impact on employment. It is going to require us to carefully watch what happens and to be in a position to correct problems as they are raised. But on balance, this is a measure that in the 100th year birthday of the minimum wage, I think is a positive and productive step forward that will create a consistency, a predictability that will enable our both business and workers to prosper here in the Golden State. And with that, I ask for an aye vote.
Thank you. Senator Bates.
Thank you, Mr. President and members. With no intention for disrespect, certainly, to my colleagues and their noble intentions with this measure, or any personal lack of sensitivity to the economic challenges that I know our low-income workers face, I do rise in opposition to the measure. I believe it is a short-term fix that will create long-term negative impact for providing job opportunities that can move our low-wage earners up the economic ladder. And colleagues, for me, that is the moral imperative that we have here in our legislature. I have taken calls and emails from constituents and business owners who've confirmed my belief that SB 3 is a false promise to those who are struggling to get ahead. And let me share with you some comments from Main Street, California small business. They are barely out of the Great Recession, and immediately following, they've had to absorb higher costs from the Affordable Care Act. New California sick pay regulations, increases in workers' compensation insurance, new regulations and cost of disposal and permits for hazardous waste disposal, new costs of complying with CARB and local air district regulations, and of course, most recently, a minimum wage increase. To stay in the black, better said, to stay in business, they must pass these increases on to consumers where possible, raising the cost of what? Goods and services, and thus the cost of living. To me, that's economic 101. They warn that sustaining a 50% increase in the cost for employees as proposed in this bill will cause them to downsize or perhaps close their businesses. One medium-sized business I spoke with provided the reality check that closing just one location, and this individual has many locations, will have the following. Those 30 employees that my colleague from Orange County mentioned will lose their jobs, and many of them are senior citizens who have those jobs to supplement their retirement incomes. 25 sales reps that go to this one location will lose an account to call on. One more vacancy in the shopping center that this business occupies, and loss of sales tax for the state. This is just one example of the impact to the private sector. And what about our public sector? The hit to the state's general fund, we've heard it over and over again, $4 billion. That's not modest. Members, we do have a special session underway to deal with our transportation infrastructure crisis. That special session was called to address what? A $3 to $6 billion shortfall. The answer, piling on more tax increases and fees, seems to be the proposal. How is it that we don't have money to repair or expand our transportation infrastructure, which, by the way, creates jobs at every economic level? But we can take more than $4 billion from a general fund to finance a wage increase that has diminishing diminished buying power, and no path to poverty over several years. This tells me there's something amiss with balancing our priorities here in our legislature, so I must respectfully oppose this measure. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Bates. Senator Hall.
Thank you, Mr. President, and my colleagues. I was not going to speak, but I sat at my desk and I wonder, where are we? Where are we? Is this really California? I'm listening to all the technical jargon and the rhetoric of the most distinguished members of this body. I'm asking the question, are we really in California? Because we can talk about COLAs, and we can talk about indexing, we can talk about all of these technical terms. But the reality is when you go to your districts and you speak in front of a room with 500 struggling families, and you talk about COLA and indexing, they will look you stare face in the eye and ask you, what in the heck are you talking about? Why? Because they're trying to figure out a way to buy their children diapers. They're finding out a way to buy their children milk. Or how might they be able to pay their utility bills? Or how might they be able to pay their rent? These are not families, my friends, that are putting away money for a rainy day fund. These are not families that are planning vacations to Europe. These are not families that are driving in Teslas and Mercedes-Benz. These are not those families. These are families that are saying, I'm struggling and no one is listening to me. In Compton, in Watts, in South Los Angeles, in the Harbor Gateway area, where rent is $1,500 a month for a one-bedroom apartment. And let me tell you something, $10.50 an hour, which is what it's going to go to next year, is $1,680 a month. So even the increase next year, of $10.50 at $680 a month still would not afford a family, a parent, to be able to afford an apartment, a one-bedroom apartment in Compton and Watts. And so we're sitting here with all these technical behaviors proselyting like great people. And the real question is, can any one of you in and on this floor actually live off of $680 a month? Can any one of you, ladies and gentlemen, afford for your own child to live off of $1,680 a month? And I will beg to say no. We have a fundamental responsibility to make sure we lift up as we climb this state. We have a fundamental responsibility to make sure when we go back to our respectful districts, that we say we advocated and fought for the most vulnerable population of our community, but yet for some of the most harding working families in our community. And I believe that if our workers are going to work every day, making companies the money that the CEOs will be able to buy their private jets, at least they can go home with dignity and pride knowing that their own utilities are being able to be paid. And so I don't look at this as a Republican issue. I don't look at this, my friends, as a Democratic issue. I look at it as a humanity issue, as an issue with pride, dignity, and respect, where parents and single women, mothers will be able to go home and replace their tears with pride, knowing that they too can go home and take care of their families and buy groceries. That's what this is about. That's what this is about. So let's talk about our COLAs and let's talk about our indexing. But the folks in our communities, they're trying to buy groceries. They're trying to pay their rent and their utility and figuring out which one is most important for that month. And so on behalf of the California Legislative Black Caucus and as a chair of the caucus, we support SB 3 and we thank the author for bringing this piece of legislation forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Hall. I just want to remind our friends in the gallery that there's no comments or responses, please. Next, we have Senator Stone.
Thank you, Mr. President. And I often wake up every morning and look in the mirror and wonder, am I still living in California? Because I don't recognize the state anymore. I'm a native Californian. I was brought up in a very low-income family. I remember shopping with my mother when my dad gave us $200 a week that had to pay for food, had to pay for insurance, had to pay for a mortgage, had to pay for school clothes. I learned quickly how to shop with coupons to make sure we got the best deals. And I was brought up to better myself, to have better opportunities than my parents and my grandparents had. I was encouraged to go to school. My grandfather came here 2 years old when he was from Russia and said, Jeff, I didn't have an opportunity to get an education. I encourage you to lift yourself out of this poverty situation, get an education and have a better life for your children than I was able to give for my children. But unfortunately, the state of California has changed. When I was growing up, we were the capital of aerospace. We were the capital of automobile manufacturing. We used to manufacture everything in the state of California. Jobs were plentiful. I lived in a post-World War II community. My parents bought a home for $15,000 5 miles from Disneyland called the Cinderella Homes. We didn't have much, but we had love, we had encouragement, and my parents urged me to stay in school, which I did, and I was able to better myself in getting a good education. And I'm a proud capitalist today because I came from poverty. I educated myself, and I opened 6 drugstores, and I opened a respiratory company, I opened a shipping company, and I created hundreds of jobs for people in my community. In fact, I still employ a lot of people in my community. And I needed those minimum wage jobs so that I could deliver pharmaceuticals to senior citizens at home without giving them a delivery charge. I had to pay maintenance people to come in and clean the pharmacy up every single day. But my heavens, how things have changed. We talk about the high cost of housing in the state of California. How's that happened? Well, look at all the fees and all the regulations that we've placed on home builders. It was this legislature that was responsible for stealing redevelopment funds. 20% set aside, to remember what that was used for? To provide low to moderate income housing for people in the state of California. We are to blame for that higher housing cost. We and we alone in the state of California. Poverty is a real problem today in the state of California. But this bill that raises the so-called minimum wage just won't fix that. I think it's even a misnomer to call it a minimum wage. We should be calling it a starting wage, because most people that get the starting wage don't end up keeping the starting wage, because most people acquire new skill sets that allow them to get paid more. They become managers. They make a better living. They get benefits. Look at the homeless population that exists here just in Sacramento. The encampments that sit here at the Ivory Tower, that we have to walk over bodies just to get here into the building. By enacting this new starting wage, you're going to be seeing a higher homeless population. And while I applaud my colleagues for their desire to make sure working families have enough to live on, this bill will have the effect of putting people out of work. As I travel through my communities, I see boarded up restaurants. Coco's gone. Mimi's restaurants gone. For lease signs in all of our commercial shopping centers, the small businessmen have given up. They've either thrown up their arms and given up, or they've moved out of state where the business environment is much better. Even our own governor doesn't believe that raising the minimum wage is a smart thing to do. I'll quote him. The net impact of an increased minimum wage on California's economy and state budget is likely to be negative. For the economy, losses from higher production costs to business would be partially offset by consumption boosts from wealthier minimum wage workers, but we should overall see a slower employment growth. This would lead to slower personal income growth and an anticipated negative impact on taxes collected. In the studies that I've seen, 45% of those that receive the minimum wage in California do not live in poverty. They live with relatives where the average income for that family exceeds $40,000 a year. Now, in our local labor committee, and I appreciate just a little bit of respect, ladies and gentlemen, as I listen to your comments, and I hope that you'll listen to mine as we take everybody's comments into consideration. My dear friend from San Francisco, we were in the Labor Committee earlier, and he made this nexus that we've seen over the past years a decrease in unemployment by 2%. And he attributed that to the raising of the minimum wage. And I appreciate those comments. I don't agree with those comments. I think we're comparing apples and oranges as we look at the growth of these high sector jobs, these high paying jobs in Silicon Valley, in the medical industry, in Hollywood. It dwarfs if you look at the bottom sector and seeing the kind of growth that they have. And then we have transportation as a special hearing here to try to raise money to fix our crumbling infrastructure, as my senator from Orange County pointed out, that we're going to be asking our citizens to be taxed by approximately the same amount that this bill is going to cost, roughly $4 billion. A state that is still struggling from the Great Recessions. Some counties, including my friend from Imperial County, have unemployment rates that still exceed 21%. Our underemployed population still continues to grow. Our kids are graduating from colleges and can't find jobs commensurate with their education. People need work, and this bill will tell small business owners who are faced with higher costs and more regulations they shouldn't even bother to open or expand. California has become a place companies just don't want to come to. According to the survey among chief executives of California, according to the CEOs, is the worst state in the union to do business in. One CEO even said California's regulation, taxes, and costs will leave only tech, life sciences, and entertainment industries as the only viable ones left. And for the second year in a row, the American Tort Reform Association identified California as the #1 judicial hellhole because of the lack of tort reform. This bill, my friends, is a feel-good measure. But our small businesses still have challenges that are forcing them to close or not expand. We have the highest workman's comp costs in the country. New paid leave rules that we've adopted have hurt many small businesses in my counties. We have the highest gas prices in the country because of our regulations and our high gas taxes. Our housing costs are out of control, which I mentioned before, and our health care costs are skyrocketing because we keep giving more benefits to people without consideration as to who is going to pay the bill. And now we're going to raise the starting wage to a point that will make it impossible for many small businesses to operate. Let's consider the impact of this measure by asking who is the typical worker who gets hired for the minimum wage. High school students, like myself, I used to be a dishwasher, used to find a job during the summer, but this will make it nearly impossible for our teenagers to find work that teaches them the value of showing up, working hard, and developing a work ethic that can make them productive throughout their careers. Senior citizens who need to supplement their income, they're living longer than they expected to, aren't going to be able to find jobs because small businesses won't be able to afford them. And single parents, these are the ones that really do need the help. Living paycheck to paycheck, 7.2% of all the people making the minimum wage won't be able to find jobs because companies won't be able to afford them. California's success was built on a strong middle class, but we're squeezing them out of existence. Things that have worked, the federal income tax credit has helped many poor people with $4,000 credits. I have a bill in the legislature that gives renters, low-income renters, income tax credits for the money that they pay for their high rent, the $1,500. But who will be hurt by this bill? Certainly farm workers. How many will be lost to machines that can pick the fruit instead of our humans? Restaurants, how many waiters and waitresses and servers will lose their jobs to iPads? How many of you have been into restaurants like Red Robin and Applebee's lately? There's no waiters or waitresses anymore. You order on an iPad. You put your credit card through the iPad, and that's how you pay your bill. They're getting wise to technology as wages go up and technology goes down. As a businessman, as a capitalist myself, I understand that these businesses are going to do what they need to survive. Hotels and motels. How many workers will be put out of work when the industry moves to self-service cleaning as an exchange for lower rates? Landscape workers. How many people that take care of our lawns and landscaping will be out of work because customers won't be able to afford a 33% increase in the minimum wage? This bill, my friends, hurts those it pretends to help. And I'm going to quote Microsoft founder Bill Gates, who recently warned, you have to be a bit careful. If you raise the minimum wage, you're encouraging labor substitution, and you're going to buy machines that automate things. My friends, industry is already doing this. 7,000 McDonald's restaurants in Europe are using kiosks for people to order and pay for their food. Amazon recently reported that they're going to start buying robots and replacing humans that are pulling the orders for Amazon. The president of the Restaurant Association recently talked about the automation that's coming to the restaurant industry. If they haven't adapted to the technology, they're absolutely looking at technology as an option, as a way to cut down on human costs. He went on to say that restaurants will buy chopped food that is already pre-chopped rather than hiring people to do the same because of the high minimum wage. So what are the choices of our small businesses? Many of those businesses that employ minimum wage workers have extremely tight margins, a very delicate balance. They can cut the hours of their employees, they can eliminate jobs, they can raise prices, they can stop plans to expand or hire more people, or worse, they could just move out of state and open up in other states or other countries. This legislature has always been big on studies. Why don't we listen to the experts when it comes to the minimum wage? According to the University of New Hampshire Survey Center, 72% of U.S. economists oppose a $15 minimum wage. 5 out of 6 economists have said the wage level will negatively affect teenage employment. 2/3 said the minimum wage of $15 would make it more difficult for small businesses to stay in business. MIT and Texas A&M studies showed that increasing the minimum wage actually reduces the number of jobs. Higher minimum wages lead to lower rates of job growth. A San Diego State University study found that the minimum wage increases are likely to hurt low-skilled workers as the increases eliminate those jobs first. And lastly, the bill will have real impacts on our state budget because of labor contracts, exempt workers that would see their wages go from $20 to $30 an hour, not to mention the compaction levels that this will create amongst our 360,000 employees. We just made IHSS employees whole on cutbacks from prior years, and this bill will require more money to be spent by state government. According to the Department of Finance, they estimated at least $3.6 billion and $400 more for Medi-Cal costs, which are not identified, added the cost to further increase the pay to IHSS workers, the DD services workers, child care and preschool workers, seasonal fire workers. The question that I've asked is, how are we going to pay this $4 billion price tag? Will it come from transportation? Will it come from public safety? Will it come from the DD community that always seems to get the short end of the stick? Or is this legislature going to do what it's done in the past and basically said, let's just increase taxes on our citizens? Members, colleagues, this is a piece of feel-good legislation, but it's wrong, it isn't right, it will put people out of work, and it will keep people from even entering the workforce. Please show some common sense and vote no on this bill that will keep people from finding a paying job in our wonderful state. Thank you for the opportunity. I urge you to vote no.
Thank you, Senator Stone. Senator Jackson.
Thank you, Mr. President. Colleagues, I was going to rise to make a brief statement on the impacts that increasing the minimum wage will have on women as the chair of the Women's Caucus, but I must make a couple observations based upon the statement of my good friend from Temecula. I grew up about the same time as my good friend from Temecula. My parents had a 1,100 square foot post-World War II home that they bought for, we think it was about $14,000. The cost of tuition for college was free. The average income tax for the wealthiest 1% was 90% of every dollar that they made over $2 million a year. They paid 90% of that overage in income tax because that money was used to build America under a president by the name of Dwight Eisenhower during a period of time when Republican presidents as well as Democratic presidents recognized that taxes were the investment that we make in our society. We didn't have an economic need for women necessarily to be working outside the home if they were in a two-parent family. You could work. My dad had a small business. My mom was a stay-at-home mom with raising 3 kids. We weren't wealthy by any stretch of the imagination, but we had the basics that we needed, and we were able to go to college, and we were able to come out of college without debt. So it's a different world we live in today. Do we want to blame housing for the problem? I think not. I think what we do need to do is address the fact that right now there are good people out there who are working 40 hours a week, doing back-breaking work, and not making enough money to support their families. That's what this minimum wage increase is all about. Our colleague indicated that we had a situation where the number one issue that we're facing isn't so much global climate change, although it is on a universal level, but income inequality. To know that you're going to get up in the morning and work a full, hard 8-hour day and then have to go out again to work another job so that you can support your family, not knowing whether or not you're going to have quality, affordable, available child care, which will take up a significant percentage of your income if you're lucky enough to find it. That is what this minimum wage bill is all about. And again, let us not be deluded. This bill doesn't increase the wage tomorrow to $15 an hour. It is a gradual increase. It has pause buttons or off-ramps or whatever you want to call them when the economy, which it probably will start to slow down. To start taking every element of society and blaming it on the decisions that are made here, not necessarily the decisions that are made on Wall Street or that are made by the big corporate interests that are housing their money offshore because they don't want to pay taxes so that other people can have opportunities. To refuse to acknowledge the fact that when you put money in the pockets of our lowest income people, that money goes right back into the economy. It helps those small businesses that you're talking about. It helps create the goods and services that generate economic well-being. So I would like to respectfully say that I completely disagree with the analysis given by my good colleague from Temecula. And I stand here as someone who grew up in similar cultural circumstances in a similar time frame with similar parental values that I bring today to this floor. We have not all been so fortunate. I look at people who are in-home service workers, who do the back-breaking work of taking care of others who they literally have to lift in order to help them bathe. I look at the farm workers who break their backs in the field every day, picking the food and the vegetables that we eat. I look at the fact that they don't have enough. I look at the fact that 64% of minimum wage workers today are women. That increasingly women are the economic backbone for their families, where 70% of mothers work today, and that more than 40% of mothers are the sole and primary breadwinners for their family, earning at least half of their family's income, and an additional 22% are co-breadwinners. Their money, their income is critical for a family to meet its basic human necessities for themselves and their children. This wage increase will begin to ensure the economic security for California's women and their families, and will make a stronger California. It will benefit all communities, including men, children, and families who count on this income to meet those basic necessities of life. And it should be noted that this compromise also provides 3 days of much-needed sick pay for those IHSS workers, the overwhelming majority of whom, by the way, also happen to be women. This is a measure that is long overdue. It is cautious, it is moderate, it is necessary. The sky will not fall, but people will be able to have their heads lifted high when they come home to their families, knowing they will be able to provide for them. And with that, I would urge your aye vote.
Thank you, Senator Jackson. Senator Anderson.
Senators, I've listened to the debate on the floor, and it's been an outstanding debate because this is a very important issue. This really determines how we feel and how we care about our fellow man, about our fellow woman. You know, if I believed in the slightest that raising this minimum wage would help the poor, I'd do it in a heartbeat. But we know that this is a false hope. You see, the measure of wealth is not in the amount of money that you make. It's in the amount of purchasing power you can buy. I could make $1 million, but if a hamburger cost me $1 million, I'm no further ahead than if I made $1 and the hamburger cost $1. Mr. Pro Tem, you can stand right here with me if you like. So when we're looking at this, we need to be thinking in terms of whether we're lifting people in our community, whether we're giving them a path to prosperity, whether we're truly achieving the goal that we set forward. And I've heard a lot of great statistics on the floor on both sides. Let me just walk you through the way I look at it. You see, I had employees working for me. And I had some employees that started off with minimum wage. And they were never meant to be set with a glass ceiling of minimum wage. My goal was always to break them through that glass ceiling, that they would never ever have to retire on minimum wage. But we would give them the path to prosperity. So you may be hired as a receptionist working for me, and you may start at minimum wage, because it took me 5 minutes to train you to be a receptionist. You answer the phone and you write down the message accurately. But then I would encourage you to go back and perhaps to learn to type. So now you could be a secretary and you could make more than minimum wage, in fact, double minimum wage. And if you did that job well, I'd encourage you to go back and get a community college degree, and I'd make you a foreman or a manager. And then you make double or triple what the typist could make. And then I'd encourage you to go back and gain additional skills so that you could be a general manager and make 6 or 8 or 10 times as much as that entry-level employee. You see, my goal was to lift people. It wasn't to hold them down. It wasn't to feed them a placebo and pretend that I was helping them. You see, if my buying power doesn't increase, then it's not really a wage hike. I've not gained anything more. I'm simply on a treadmill running fast, thinking I'm getting further ahead, but never moving anywhere. That's unfair to entry-level workers. That's unfair to our fellow Californians. You see, I believe that we should be holding the UC system accountable. We just had an audit report last week that said that they were giving priority treatment to students with lesser grades from out of state because they were so greedy they wanted that out-of-state pay. So that our kids in our community wouldn't have access to the schools that our taxes paid for. It's outrageous to me that we're not focused more on vocational education and the UC and the CSU system giving people a path to prosperity. To turn around and to give them false hope and feed them a placebo and say, oh, we're doing wonderful things, and oh, by the way, next week when you can't buy a hamburger or any more hamburgers than the hamburgers that you're purchasing today, because we know that in most products and services, 80% of the cost of that product or service, in most, as a general rule, is labor. And by artificially increasing the cost of that labor, they're no further ahead. They're simply on a treadmill, running faster and faster, never getting ahead. And yet, we're giving them that false hope. We're saying to them that we're lifting you and we're giving you a path. Yet the people, the greedy people in the UC system, that are withholding slots from our children, not giving them access to the education that will lead to a world-class career and job, is absolutely outrageous to me. Look, I want to work across party lines. I want to lift people. I don't think that anybody should have to live in poverty in this day and age in California or anywhere in the United States. But let's go at the real crux of it. Let's help people become the best they can be. Let's not put a false ceiling on them and say, oh, we're going to raise minimum wage again in a few years to $20 an hour because we want you to retire on it. I don't want anybody retiring on it. And I get it that some people have to earn minimum wage because they don't have the skill sets, but I want to change their skill sets because I believe in them. I believe they're worth more than that. And while they have a great pride on that minimum job, that entry-level job, I admire them for the pride in work. But you know what gives them more pride? It's the pride that comes for providing from your family. That's the greatest pride anybody can have, is being able to provide for your family. And when you give them false hope, and when you steal their future by simply raising their wage but not giving them earning potential that leads to buying potential, then you've stolen from them. Now, let's go one step further. So who else gets hurt by this? The middle class. You see, that person that started, who went back to school, learned to type, got their associate's degree, got their bachelor's degree, is now the general manager, who's worked their way up over the last 15 years, working extra hours on Saturdays and Sundays to ensure that they got promoted. Their buying power's decreased because the cost of hamburgers, the cost of everything around them, has now been raised through inflation. So we've brought them closer to the bottom. We have not increased the bottom in any way, shape, or form. And who gains? The uber rich. This is a bill for the uber rich. They're the only ones because you know what? No one's going to rise up and hold them accountable. No one's going to rise up and be angry because, after all, we fed them a placebo by giving them a false hope, by keeping them on a treadmill instead of getting them off the treadmill and giving them a path to prosperity. So I also look at it and I think, well, maybe this does help them. Let's say that it does help them. What about our seniors who are on fixed incomes? What about anybody who's on a fixed income? Because this is an inflation driver. And if my goal was to help people retire on minimum wage, I would vote for this in a heartbeat. But my goal is to break that glass ceiling that we're trying to put on poor people and give them a path to prosperity so they don't have to retire on minimum wage. I want to give them the block grants necessary to get the vocational skills that make the work they do worth more. I want to give them the education path, and I'm not going to allow greedy UC regions to bring students from out of state so they can collect extra monies as opposed to putting our kids, our constituents' children, giving them first priority on our tax dollars and giving them a world-class education. Listen, I want to lift those people. I don't want them to be in poverty, just like you do. That's the one theme that no matter who speaks on this floor all agrees with. Nobody came here to keep people poor. We all came here, but we have different views on how to get there. And I respect everybody for the wonderful debate and the fact that their heart's in the right place. But let's do something that's truly meaningful by my standard, and that's to give people a path to prosperity. Don't hold them down. Don't pretend to tell them that we're enriching their lives by not giving them one additional element of education, not one additional skill, not one additional craft. Instead, we're just patting them on the head to make them go away to the next election cycle. Because it'll be 5 years before they figure out there's been a bait and switch. They're making more money. They're just not buying more. They're not making a mortgage payment because they still can't afford a house. They're not eating out every night because they don't have the money to do that. They're literally living from paycheck to paycheck because we didn't enrich them as people. We devalued them by giving them a placebo and sending them on their way. Let's get them off the treadmill. Let's put them to work in a way that leads to a prosperous future. And that means they need skills. Whether those skills come academically or vocationally, it doesn't matter. But let's put them on a trajectory that leads to a better future. Members, I want to work with you. I'm eager to look and talk about block grants to help people get those vocational skills or education skills, and I hope that you work with me in holding the UC regions accountable for forcing our kids to go out of state for school because they don't provide the slots to us. You know, what I thought was most outrageous in that audit was that they were accepting students that were lesser qualified from out of state because they valued the money more than they valued our citizens. And that's just plain wrong. And if we allow that to continue and yet continue to raise minimum wage, we have failed the poor because we've never changed their standard in life. In fact, we've denied them access to what their taxes have paid for, a quality education. Please join me in supporting the poor by giving them a path to prosperity, not a placebo. I urge a no vote.
Senator Galgiani.
Members, I've really struggled with this bill, but I rise today in support of this bill and can't help but remember what it was like for my mom as a single mother and when I was growing up. And I don't talk about that very often, but my mom worked as a dog groomer. She made about minimum wage, less than $100 a week. She couldn't afford a babysitter, so she had us take the bus to her place of work, and we would do our homework there. And then we would go over to the Kmart shopping center, where we would hang out at a bookstore that was in that center, and we would read comic books and wait for my mom to get off work. And then when she got a little bit of a raise, she was able to get us a membership at the YMCA. So after school, we would walk to the library, do our homework, and go next door to the YMCA, where there were people around that could watch over us. When I moved away from home at age 18, I worked fast food. I worked at Taco Bell. Those of us who were living in our own place, we would wait and eat our first meal at work that day at about 3 o'clock because that's how we made ends meet. We couldn't afford to have food and pay our rent and do everything. So I do remember how hard it was and what a struggle it was. I do worry about my district because as we've been hit with the housing crisis and the budget crisis and everything else, we're always the last to recover. I would have wished that this bill might have had pauses and off-ramps that would look at regions so that if any one region in the state were to be lagging in retail sales or lagging in job growth, it would be recognized and there would be a bright light that my district would need some help. But as Senator Hertzberg pointed out, we can always make changes, and that's what we're here for. That's the job that we do. So I tried to look at the history of the minimum wage and what people were getting in the past. And specifically, I looked at what's happened since the time that I've been here working as a chief of staff to my predecessor, and then my time in the Assembly and in the Senate. And in 2002, minimum wage was $6.75 an hour. There were no minimum wage increases during the dot-com boom. And when we had the budget crisis of 2004 and 5, there were no minimum wage increases. And then when we had the main budget crisis, there were no minimum wage increases either. So between 2002 and today, 14 years later, there have been 9 years where there was no increase at all. And if you look at the increase of $3.25 over 14 years, what that really averages out to is about 3.4% each year, or 23 cents an hour each year. So I think that what we're doing today is going to help a lot of families, a lot of people who really, really struggle. And as I look around my district, I see it's very obvious that there's less money in my district and that people are really hurting. And I believe as a body that our job is to constantly monitor what's happening, and we can make changes, and that's what we're here for, and I believe that we'll do that. So I ask for your support.
Thank you. Senator Leyva.
Thank you, Mr. President. Good afternoon, members. I rise in strong support of SB 3. On December 1st, 2014, I was lucky enough to be sworn into the California State Senate. On that same day, the great senator from San Francisco came to me and asked me if I would like to be a joint author on SB 3. I thought, wow, this is going to be a pretty cool job. My first day on the job, and I already get to do something that's going to make a difference. Members, I would argue that we have given corporations the opportunity to do the right thing. Corporations currently hold more wealth than they've ever held at any other time in this country. Yet more workers are living in poverty, more full-time workers are living in poverty than any other time before. So we have allowed these corporations to do very well, to do extremely well, but yet they haven't shared that wealth with the people that are pushing up the money to them. In my district, in San Bernardino County, 28% of the children live in poverty. This is because mom and dad are working harder than they've ever worked before, but their minimum wage jobs aren't letting them pay the bills. Members, for the last 20 years, we have seen a race to the bottom when it comes to wages, both here in California and across the country. The Walmartization of California and the United States has taken a huge toll on workers everywhere. Instead of focusing on making sure that workers have a job that can pay their bills, the focus of corporations has been to wildly increase their profits off the backs of their workforces. So here today, we have an opportunity to say no more. Most people who work full-time or close to full-time also receive state aid. I think that's wrong, and I think all of you would agree with that. We talk about education being an investment in our future. I would say that eradicating poverty is an investment in all our collective futures. After all, Californians work hard, and they should be rewarded for their labor. As we have done so many times before, California now stands to lead in this industry, in this historic legislation. A living wage should not just be a reality for employers, but rather something within the reach of all employees that are willing to work hard to ensure a brighter future for themselves and their loved ones. I have been told on numerous occasions that there are different bills that we author and pass here in the legislature that make it hard for businesses to do business in California. But no one has ever said to me, boy, we sure are making it hard on workers because they have to live on part-time jobs, low-wage jobs, and in many instances, temporary jobs. I, too, did a little research for comparative purposes. In 1988, some of you have heard me tell this story, in 1988, when my husband and I got married, we were both making $13.50 an hour. The minimum wage was only $4.25 at the time, but we had good union jobs. The house that we were able to buy at age 21 and 23 was $99,990, just short of $100,000. Gas was 95 cents a gallon, and a dozen eggs was 65 cents. So when we talk about things going up, everything is already going up around us except wages. Right now, a house is about $300,000. Gas has gone down a little bit, but it's still between $2.70 a gallon and $3. A dozen eggs, if you're lucky, is $3.99. So we look back at that $13.50 an hour that my husband and I were making. So if we were just cautious and increase that by 3, that wage should now be $40.50 an hour to keep up with the prices that have already gone up around us. But of course we know that is not what has happened. So the minimum wage is just a way for us to say, we believe in you. We want to make sure that we can lift folks out of poverty. I understand that some opponents are afraid of the unknown since we would be raising California's minimum wage over time to several dollars above where we stand. But I would also point to the fear and uncertainty that a low-wage worker feels and lives every single day, that they may be evicted from their apartment and not be able to feed or buy clothes for their children simply because they can't make ends meet. Californians deserve better. So members, Today, let us dare to expect more for everyone in our society. Let's begin today with a race to the top so that all workers who work full-time can provide for their families. After all, members, a good job, not any job, but a good job fixes a lot of what ails us in society. The good senator from Temecula and I don't always agree on a lot, but I would also agree that this is absolutely feel-good legislation, because for the workers that this affects, they're going to feel good when they can pay their electric bill. They're going to feel good when they can put groceries on the table for their family. And they're going to feel good when they can buy a pair of shoes for their son or daughter to go to school. So members, in honor of Cesar Chavez, si se puede, we can do it. I urge an aye vote. Thank you.
Thank you. Senator Fuller.
Mr. President, members, and guests, this approach today that we have been debating might make sense for big coastal cities in California who have already voluntarily passed their own minimum wage increase, because the ability to do that exists, and communities that want to do that have gone ahead and done that. They have relatively low unemployment with a high cost of living. But this is not the case for all of California. Emerging from the recession has not been equal across this state. Some inland cities, especially valley cities like Bakersfield, Fresno, and other countless rural communities, especially in my San Bernardino County area, these areas do not have the same cost of living problems as some California, especially coastal cities. $150,000 home in Bakersfield costs over $750,000 in San Francisco. For every $1 you spend on cost of living in Bakersfield, you have to spend $2.30 in San Francisco. And the list goes on and on. However, while it is less expensive to live in Bakersfield, our unemployment numbers are startlingly higher than the coastal communities and some other of the big cities in California due to overregulation and cost-driving factors that we haven't been able to fix. We have suffered from legislative policies that didn't work and a regulatory stranglehold on industries that traditionally supply countless jobs. Of the 10 most populous California cities, only 2 of them have unemployment over 6.5%. It should be no shock that these 2 cities are situated in the valley, with Bakersfield at 9.6% and Fresno at 11.5%, almost double the state average. A one-size-fits-all approach would have extremely negative consequences for a very large number of Californians. That is why a blanket approach is wrong. While this piece of legislation does provide certain off-ramps, and those are appreciated, it does not take into account the wide disparity of unemployment rates between counties, as legislation from other states has. Let the local governments and communities decide for themselves what works best. They know their facts. They know their circumstances. They want to thrive. Before the residents of some California communities are even able to think about the cost of groceries, they are faced with the fact that they cannot get a job. They cannot put food on the table in the first place. I urge a no vote for the constituents of my district.
Thank you, Senator Fuller. Senator De Leon.
Mr. President, colleagues, I rise in a very proud manner to support this measure to give millions of Californians, millions of California's working families, a long overdue raise. At its core, this proposal is about fairness. It's about real opportunity. It's about restoring the American dream. If you work hard and play by the rules, you get a shot at a decent life and a better life for your children. That dream, as we all know, and I think that Democrats and Republicans can agree together, that dream, as we know, has been fading for decades. Wages for working people have stagnated since the mid-70s. This is a real statistical fact that cannot be interpreted differently. Wages since the mid-70s have stagnated for working families. Meanwhile, consumer costs, as well as corporate profits, as well as executive compensation, have skyrocketed. And that is the difference. That is the gulf. That is the chasm. That is the conflict that exists today in the United States of America. The anxiety, the anger that we hear from both the right as well as the left and everyone in between. Today's CEOs make nearly 300 times what a typical earner makes, according to the Economic Policy Institute. The fact is that we're working more and earning less, much less. Today, a full-time worker who earns the minimum wage in California before taxes earns less than $20,000 a year. A worker who works full-time in California before taxes earns less than $20,000 a year. That's less than the federal poverty line for a single breadwinner for 2 children. That's not a living wage. That, in fact, is a poverty wage. It's not enough to even cover the basic necessities, such as health care and child care, much less save for the future. Now, as was mentioned before earlier, we'll be tackling that issue with regards to retirement security. And that doesn't even include the issue of wage theft, where we lose hundreds of millions of dollars on an annual basis. In fact, the city of Los Angeles loses on an annual basis due to wage theft $1 billion a year. Colleagues, with this vote, we are working for working families. And how fitting is it that we do this today on Cesar Chavez Day? Opponents will say, they have said, that the minimum wage is not intended to support a family. That is correct. There's no dispute there. That it is, in fact, for the young, unskilled workers who are just getting started. I know for a lot of us, it's sort of a rite of passage to work hard, to be industrious, to work at a first minimum wage job, whether it's in and out or wherever it may be, and hopefully through community college, Cal State, UC education, or a good solid vocational job, we move up the ranks. But that narrative is inaccurate for millions of workers today because it is non-existent for the individuals who work as valet workers, security officers, and other types of jobs who stay there year after year after year after year with the same minimum wage job with no health benefits whatsoever. That is the accurate, realistic narrative of today. Not the high school teenage kid that works at Carl's Jr. That's that rite of passage of working for minimum wage and then you just move up the ranks eventually. The narrative is all the men and women who are up today in the gallery, who work these jobs every single day, doing everything possible to put a roof over their child's head, to put the food on the table and the clothes on their child's back. That is an antiquated narrative that is non-existent today. It does not reflect our reality. Take, for example, Belia Perez from Tracy. She works in a food processing plant in Central Valley, and she struggles to support her family on minimum wage. But she's just one of millions with a similar predicament. Today, 5 million Californians, that's roughly 1/3, 32% of Californians earn less than $15 an hour. That is a stunning statistic. You have often heard me say at press conferences here on this very same floor, we are the 7th largest economy on planet Earth. Not in the United States, not in North America or the Western Hemisphere. On Earth. When we disaggregate the data, as we all know, on some parts of the states, feels like the second Gilded Age. In other parts of the state, where we go down Central Valley and we make a left, and we go to Inland Empire, you feel the stagnation and you feel that no one has felt the positive economic resurgence of being the 7th largest economy in the world. I think we all believe that lifting these people from poverty into a living wage is one of the biggest economic stimulators that we can have in the state of California. Many of these workers don't just work full-time for minimum wage. They work 2 or 3 jobs to make ends meet. At $15 minimum wage, that would perhaps be barely enough to exceed the federal poverty line. And at the time, it would surely have helped my mother, that time a single mother with 3 children, and someone like Belia Perez, who lives at the processing plant or works at the processing plant in Tracy. This is not by any stretch of the imagination a luxurious standard of living. Colleagues, today we are investing in our human capital, Californians. We are investing in our future. We're making a pragmatic decision by voting on this measure, SB 3, today, as opposed to allowing the external forces to make the decision for us. It's pragmatic. It is smart decision-making. It is our responsibility as elected officials to take on the controversial issues. No matter how polemic and polarizing they may be, we make those decisions on this Senate floor as well as the Assembly floor. It is pragmatic because once it becomes enshrined into law constitutionally and the people vote for the measure, you can't roll it back. You can't make a fix here or there. You can't make a modification, it must be. That's why it gives us the flexibility to do what we need to do as we move forward with whatever type of economy that we face. This is a higher minimum wage, but a smarter minimum wage. It provides the uniformity across the board. I cannot tell you how many phone calls I have received by city council members as well as county board of supervisors, both Democrats as well as Republicans. Thank you very much. It relieves us from the pressure of making the decisions at the local level. We appreciate this. This is from our Republican friends who are city council members as well as supervisors throughout the state of California. Of course, you know I'm going to have to publicly oppose this measure, but wink, wink, thank you. This is reality. These are the phone calls I've received the past week. I want to thank the good colleague from La Miranda because the statistics that he provided and articulated are as accurate as they are. In 1976, the minimum wage was $2 an hour. 1976. Now, with a national CPI index, and of course, the national CPI index is much more conservative than our state index, which we use as a methodology, San Francisco and Los Angeles County, highly weighted for 2 very big urban areas. The national CPI is much more conservative and less robust as our state CPI. Using the national CPI, 1976, minimum wage, $2 an hour. Again, no legislative action. If there were no legislative action at all whatsoever, fast forward today, the minimum wage would be $5.50. $5.68. $5.68. That's an increase of $3.68 over a course of 40 years. Now be mindful, again, national CPI with a cap of 3.5%. That's a $3.68 pay increase over a course of 40 years. That is an instrument, a tool, an economic tool that's indisputable. Irrespective of what has been said today, when you get down to it, that is the financial instrument that measures objectively and neutrally where we would be if we just had a national CPI. We know that this has a CPI every year thereafter, come 2022 for large businesses and 2023 for smaller businesses, assuming there's no downturn in the economy and we hit the pause button. But at least we have a pause button. May not be perfect, but constitutionally, if the ballot initiative continues, there is no pause button at all whatsoever. So for small businesses and large alike, and to all the chambers of commerce, this is a smart, pragmatic decision. It's not a world of absolutes, but we just fly over the cliff and say, you know what, we're just going to go in flames and try to defeat this measure, irrespective of how the economy rolls. This is our reality. Over 40 years, $3.68 with the national CPI. That is for a gallon of milk, that's $2.68. A loaf of bread, on average, maybe $4. That's all you would get. That is the difference. Mr. President, en el país más rico de la nación de este planeta, nadie que trabaje tiempo completo debería ser obligado a vivir en la pobreza. En este día que honramos a César Chávez, uno de los líderes laborales más destacados y más importantes de nuestra historia, no olvidamos los sacrificios que hizo por un mejor salario, una mejor condición en su lugar de trabajo para los millones de trabajadores que buscan una vida mejor, para la vida de millones de trabajadores que piscan en los files día tras día y noche tras noche, piscando la alcachofa, la uva, el jitomate, la cebolla y el apio. Los hombres y mujeres que trabajan día a noche, haciendo todo lo posible para mejorar la condición humana para nuestras familias. En un día tan histórico, el salario mínimo se encamina hacia los $15 la hora. Vamos a restaurar a California el sueño dorado, el sueño americano, para las familias que están trabajando día y noche sin descanso. This is historic. And today, I'm very proud to be a Californian.
Thank you, Senator De Leon. Senator Morale.
Thank you. So I appreciate you letting me speak. I'll make this short. We've spoken about many things here today, but a couple of my colleagues mentioned on the floor, one said, you know, the average CEO makes whatever, $300,000 or $400,000 a year. Another one talked about holding corporations who hold their money. I just like to share about those people who want to open a business like I did years ago. It's very tough in this type of atmosphere for any emerging entrepreneur to want to open a business. When I opened my business, it was just me. Where I lacked in talent, I made up for hard work. I can honestly say without any falsehood, there was days that I worked from 5 a.m. to 11 p.m. at night, and it was tough. And so my first goal was just to be able to get enough money to hire receptionists and then eventually grow the business. I sought a lot of outside counsel. I'm told that in a multitude of their counselors, there's victory, so I worked hard to find people that were helpful in business. And eventually, my company, over a number of years, did build up. I was able to pay people profit sharing, as well as open 3 corporations eventually. But I will tell you, in this day and age, I'm not sure if I had to start over again, I don't think I'd have enough confidence that I could overcome some of the hurdles here in California, not just the regulation, but particularly a $15 an hour minimum wage. And so it's one thing to talk about the large corporations, but what about the emerging entrepreneur? I'm putting together a seminar for disadvantaged people, along with some other community leaders here in the next future, because they want to open businesses. It's going to be very difficult for me to clearly communicate to them how they're going to get over some of these hurdles. So though I do appreciate some of the things that were said about large corporations, I'm more concerned about the little guy. And again, if I had to start over, I would have to think twice about whether to do that. And now with this seminar coming up in a few weeks, not really sure how I'm going to thread that needle, because this is a huge hurdle for people that have little money. So anyway, with that is why I still side with a free market economy and will be voting no on this. So thanks for your time.
Thank you, members. That concludes our debate on this issue. Senator Leno, please close.
Thank you, Mr. President. Colleagues, good demonstration of variety of beliefs, representing how we see the world, how we believe our districts and constituents see the world. Out of respect for time, I will be very brief in my close. I will not spend a few minutes correcting some of the misstatements attributed to me. I'll just let it pass. In the end, to refine all of the components of this debate, I think a question that we can ask ourselves is it good public policy? Is it good public policy to allow for the legal payment of sub-poverty wages and all of its ramifications? Is it good public policy to have millions of Californians trapped in sub-poverty wages and literally living paycheck to paycheck at fear of inability to pay rent next month because someone got sick or the car broke down, and now you're teetering on the edge of homelessness? Is that good public policy? Is it good public policy that we continue, we the taxpayers, to subsidize families like the Walton family, the wealthiest family on earth, worth well over $100 billion, because we taxpayers are paying for their employees health care, food, and housing subsidies. That's the status quo. And is it good public policy to have children living in poverty, suffering the psychological, emotional, and physical consequences of that status? I would suggest that it is not good public policy. And if this is not the legislative step we should be taking to change that status quo, then I'm open to anything else. But I've been here 14 years now, and I haven't seen anything that would change those status quos that I've just commented on. SB 3, quite simply, respects and rewards work. It reduces employee turnover. It increases employee productivity and consumer spending, which represents 70% of our economy, thereby stimulating economic growth. At the same time, helping workers, low-wage workers, finally end their dependence on public assistance programs. That's what SB 3 does. I want to thank my joint author, Connie Leyva, who is there with us from day one. Thank you, Mr. Pro Tem Kevin DeLeon, for joining us as a joint author, and for all of your leadership working with the governor and the speaker and the stakeholders in getting us to this very proud moment. I ask for your concurrence on the Assembly amendments.
Secretary, please call the roll.
Allen? Aye. Anderson? No. Bates? No. Bell? Aye. Berryhill? Block? Aye. Cannella? No. De Leon? Aye. Fuller? No. Gaines? No. Galgiani? Aye. Glazer? Aye. Hall? Aye. Hancock? Aye. Hernandez? Aye. Hertzberg? Aye. Hill? Aye. Weso? Aye. Huff? No. Jackson? Aye. Lara? Aye. Leno? Aye. Leyva? Aye. Liu? Aye. McGuire? Aye. Mendoza? I. Mitchell. I. Monning. Morlock. No. Morrell. No. Wynn. No. Nilsson. No. Pan. I. Pavley. I. Roth. I. Runner. Stone. No. Vidak. No. Wykowski. I. Wolk. Wolk, aye.
Secretary, please call the absent members.
Berryhill. Monning. I. Runner.
Ayes 26, noes 12. The Assembly amendments are concurred in. Remind our guests in the gallery there is no shouting.